Whispers of towering shapes in the fog, glowing eyes in the night, and shattered campsites left in ruin have haunted remote forests for generations. Some claim accidents, others insist predators, but survivors tell of something far larger, faster, and more intelligent than anything known. From a massacre in Karelia to a stolen catch in Oregon, each story reveals escalating terror and impossible strength. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters that expose the deadly reality behind these mysterious predators. The remote forests of Karelia, Russia, stretched endlessly across the border region between Russia and Finland, a wilderness known for its ancient pines, glacial lakes, and impenetrable fog that rolled in without warning. In September 2025, this vast expanse of taiga had become the hunting ground for a group of experienced hunters who had traveled from Moscow seeking elk and brown bear. The region had long been home to Karelian folklore, speaking of forest giants, but modern hunters dismissed such tales as superstition left over from darker times. Dmitry Volkov led the hunting party, a seasoned outdoorsman in his 50s who had been guiding expeditions through Karelia for over 2 decades. His group consisted of 4 other hunters: Alexei Petrov, a wealthy businessman seeking adventure; Ivan Kravchenko, a former military officer turned hunting enthusiast; Mikhail Sokolov, a local guide familiar with the terrain; and Boris Fedorov, Dmitry's longtime hunting partner. They had established their camp in a clearing roughly 30 kilometers from the nearest logging road, deep enough into the wilderness to avoid other hunting parties, but accessible enough for their planned week-long expedition. The morning of September 9th began like any other. The hunters had risen before dawn, checking their equipment and preparing for what they hoped would be a productive day, tracking elk through the dense undergrowth. Dmitry's 10-year-old grandson, Pavel Volkov, had accompanied the expedition against his mother's wishes, eager to learn hunting skills from his grandfather. The boy had been instructed to remain at camp while the men ventured deeper into the forest, but Pavel had grown restless as the morning fog thickened around their temporary home. Around midday, the hunting party returned to camp for lunch and to plan their afternoon route. The fog had become so dense that visibility was reduced to mere meters, creating an eerie atmosphere that even the experienced hunters found unsettling. Mikhail mentioned hearing unusual sounds during their morning hunt, deep, guttural calls that did not match any known wildlife in the region. Ivan dismissed the concern, attributing the sounds to the acoustic tricks that fog could play in dense forest. As the hunters gathered around their camp stove to prepare a meal, Pavel wandered toward the edge of the clearing with Dmitry's hunting dog, a German shepherd named Grom. The boy had been fascinated by the strange silence that had settled over the forest, broken only by the occasional drip of condensation from the pine branches overhead. He moved perhaps 50 meters from the main camp when Grom suddenly began barking frantically, his hackles raised and teeth bared towards something hidden in the fog. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Pavel later recalled hearing his grandfather shout, followed immediately by sounds unlike anything he had experienced before. The crash of splintering wood, mixed with what could only be described as roars of rage, deep and resonant enough to be felt in the chest. The 5 hunters grabbed their rifles and rushed toward the source of the commotion, but the fog disoriented them, making it impossible to distinguish direction or distance. Alexei was the first to encounter the creature. His scream cut through the fog as something massive struck him, with enough force to send his body flying into a nearby pine tree. The sound of his rifle discharging was followed by an inhuman shriek of pain and fury. Ivan fired blindly into the fog, his military training taking over as he attempted to establish a defensive position. His shots were answered by the sound of something enormous crashing through the underbrush, moving with impossible speed for its apparent size. Mikhail managed to glimpse the creature as it emerged from the fog like a nightmare made manifest. Standing nearly 3 meters tall and covered in dark, matted fur, it moved with a fluid grace that defied its bulk. Its eyes reflected the pale morning light with an intelligence that chilled him to the bone. Before he could raise his rifle, Massive hands seized him by the shoulders and lifted him from the ground. His screams echoed through the forest until they were abruptly silenced. Boris attempted to retreat toward the camp, hoping to reach the radio and call for help, but the creature seemed to anticipate his movement. It materialized from the fog directly in his path, and Boris had only a moment to register the prehistoric features and burning eyes before claws raked across his chest. His rifle fell unfired as he collapsed, life leaving his body in seconds. Dmitri pushed through the fog, calling desperately for his grandson, but he never made it back to camp. The creature struck him down near the tents, his body discovered later among the wreckage. His hunting knife lay snapped beside him, a final sign of resistance that had lasted only moments against overwhelming strength. The attack lasted no more than 3 minutes from beginning to end, but when silence finally returned to the forest, all 5 hunters lay dead among the scattered remains of their equipment. Tents had been shredded as if by enormous hands, backpacks ripped open with contents strewn across the forest floor, and rifles destroyed with casual brutality that spoke of immense power. Deep gouges in the soft earth revealed footprints nearly half a meter long, pressed deep into the mud by incredible weight. Pavel was discovered hours later by a group of hikers who had heard Grom's persistent barking echoing through the fog. The boy was found crammed into a hollow beneath a fallen pine log, clutching the terrified dog and trembling uncontrollably. His clothes were torn and muddy, but he appeared physically unharmed. When the hikers attempted to question him, Pavel could only whisper about glowing eyes in the mist and shadows that moved faster than anything human. The scene that greeted the rescue team defied easy explanation. Trees near the clearing showed vertical scratches extending several meters up their trunks, bark stripped away in long parallel lines as if marked by massive claws. Small fires still smoldered where overturned lanterns had ignited patches of dried pine needles. The systematic nature of the destruction suggested intelligence rather than random animal behavior. The incident on September 9, 2025, became one of the most thoroughly documented encounters with an unknown creature in modern Russian history, though the official records remain sealed. Local guides now avoid the area where Dmitry Volkov's hunting party met their end, and the region has developed a reputation that keeps even the most adventurous outdoorsmen away. Pavel Volkov, now approaching his 11th birthday, still wakes screaming from nightmares about glowing eyes in the fog, and refuses to discuss what he witnessed on that terrifying morning when something ancient and terrible emerged from the Karelian wilderness to reclaim its territory with swift and brutal efficiency. The remote wilderness of northwestern Montana stretched endlessly across the Continental Divide, a region where civilization gave way to pristine forests of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. In the summer of 2019, the United States Forest Service maintained a small patrol outpost roughly 40 kilometers from the nearest town, serving as a supply depot and communication hub for rangers working the vast territory. The outpost consisted of a single building, a generator shed, and several storage units, connected to the outside world only by a narrow dirt road that became impassable during winter months. Lucas Meyer had been assigned to the night shift at this isolated station for 3 months, a posting that suited his preference for solitude and quiet work. The 32-year-old former park ranger had taken the position after a difficult divorce, seeking the peace that only complete wilderness could provide. His duties were straightforward: monitor radio communications, maintain supply inventories, and ensure the generator remained operational throughout the night. Most evenings passed without incident, the silence broken only by the occasional call from patrol units checking in from distant sectors. The facility had been established in 1987, following a series of wildfires that devastated the region, and local indigenous communities had initially opposed its construction. Tribal elders spoke of sacred grounds and warned that certain areas of the forest should remain undisturbed, but their concerns were dismissed as superstition by government officials. Over the years, several rangers had reported unusual incidents at the outpost: equipment found displaced, strange sounds in the darkness, and a persistent feeling of being watched from the tree line. On the night of August 15, 2019, Lucas arrived for his shift at sunset, relieving the day supervisor, who seemed unusually eager to depart. The evening began routinely enough, with Lucas conducting his standard equipment checks and settling into the small office to monitor radio traffic. The generator hummed steadily outside, providing power to the communications equipment and floodlights that illuminated the immediate area around the building. Around 11 o'clock, Lucas noticed that the generator's rhythm had become irregular, stuttering occasionally before returning to its normal cadence. Concerned that a mechanical failure might leave the outpost without power, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to investigate. The night air carried the crisp scent of pine and the distant sound of an owl calling from the forest. He made his way to the generator shed, located approximately 50 meters from the main building, following the familiar path he had walked dozens of times before. The generator appeared to be functioning normally when Lucas examined it, though he noticed several loose bolts on the housing that might have been causing the irregular vibrations. He spent perhaps 10 minutes tightening the connections and checking fuel levels, satisfied that the equipment would continue operating through the night. The walk back to the main building took him past the supply storage area where wooden crates and metal containers held everything from emergency rations to communication equipment. Upon reaching the storage area, Lucas immediately noticed that something was wrong. Several wooden crates had been overturned, their contents scattered across the gravel surface. Metal containers that normally required 2 people to move had been displaced as if they weighed nothing. His first assumption was that wildlife had somehow accessed the storage area, though he could not imagine what animal would be capable of moving such heavy objects. Lucas swept his flashlight beam across the disturbed area, attempting to assess the extent of the damage and determine what might have caused it. The beam illuminated scattered supplies, broken containers, and deep impressions in the soft soil that surrounded the storage area. These impressions were unlike any animal tracks he had encountered during his years in wilderness areas, measuring nearly 18 inches in length and pressed deep into the earth by tremendous weight. As he knelt to examine the tracks more closely, Lucas became aware of a presence watching him from the darkness beyond the floodlights. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, a primitive recognition of being observed by something intelligent and potentially dangerous. He slowly raised his flashlight toward the tree line, sweeping the beam across the dense wall of pine trees that surrounded the outpost. The light reflected off 2 large eyes positioned nearly 3 meters above the ground, glowing with an amber luminescence that seemed almost supernatural. Lucas froze, his rational mind struggling to process what he was seeing while his instincts screamed at him to retreat to the safety of the building. The eyes remained fixed on him for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, belonging to a massive figure that stood motionless among the trees. The creature appeared to be covered in dark fur, with shoulders broader than any human, and a bulk that suggested enormous physical power. It made no sound as it observed him, displaying an intelligence that was far more unsettling than simple animal curiosity. Lucas found himself unable to move, transfixed by the realization that he was being evaluated by something that clearly understood the significance of their encounter. After several long moments, the figure simply melted back into the forest with a silence that defied its apparent size. Lucas heard no breaking branches, no footsteps, no sound whatsoever to indicate which direction the creature had gone. The eyes simply disappeared, leaving him alone with his racing heart and the scattered supplies that testified to an encounter beyond his understanding. Lucas remained frozen for several minutes after the creature vanished, his flashlight beam searching the tree line for any sign of movement. When he finally found the courage to move, he backed slowly toward the main building, never turning away from the forest. Once inside, he immediately reached for the radio to contact his supervisors, though he struggled to find words that would adequately describe what he had witnessed. The response team arrived within 2 hours, consisting of his supervisor and 2 local sheriff's deputies, who seemed skeptical of his account from the moment they arrived. They conducted a thorough search of the area, documenting the disturbed supplies and photographing the unusual footprints, but found no trace of the creature itself. The official report attributed the incident to a prank by local teenagers, or possibly a bear that had somehow accessed the storage area. Lucas knew that his career with the Forest Service would be damaged by filing a report about an encounter with an unknown creature, but he felt obligated to document what he had experienced. His supervisors were polite, but clearly doubtful, suggesting that the isolation and stress of night duty might have affected his perception. Within a month, he was quietly transferred to a day position at a visitor center, effectively ending his assignment at the remote outpost. Local indigenous community leaders were not surprised when word of the incident reached them through unofficial channels. Tribal elders nodded knowingly, explaining that the outpost had been built on land that their people had always avoided during certain seasons. They spoke of ancient guardians that watched over the deepest parts of the forest, beings that normally avoided human contact, but would sometimes reveal themselves to deliver warnings. Lucas Meyer left the Forest Service 6 months after his encounter, unable to reconcile his experience with an organization that preferred conventional explanations for unusual events. He moved to a small town in Colorado where he now works as a carpenter and rarely speaks about his time in Montana. On quiet nights, however, he still finds himself scanning tree lines and listening for sounds that might indicate he's being watched by something vast and intelligent, something that chose to reveal itself briefly before disappearing back into the wilderness where it belongs. The Colorado Rockies rose dramatically from the high plains in July 2017, their snow-capped peaks visible from hundreds of kilometers away. Deep within these mountains, far from established hiking trails and camping areas, lay vast expanses of wilderness that remained largely unexplored by casual outdoor enthusiasts. Nathan Cole, a 26-year-old outdoor equipment tester from Denver, had organized what he intended to be a week-long camping expedition with 3 close friends. Riley Marks, Sarah Jensen, and Liam Ortiz were all experienced campers who shared Nathan's passion for exploring remote wilderness areas. Liam had brought along his 18-year-old sister, Emily, despite concerns from other group members that the challenging terrain might be too difficult for someone with limited backpacking experience. The group had hiked for 2 days to reach their chosen campsite, a small clearing beside a mountain stream roughly 15 kilometers from the nearest Forest Service road. The location offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks and appeared to provide adequate shelter from the wind that constantly swept across the high alpine environment. Local weather reports indicated several days of clear conditions, perfect for the type of wilderness experience the group sought. Emily Ortiz had initially been excited about joining her brother's camping trip, viewing it as an opportunity to prove herself capable of handling challenging outdoor adventures. However, the altitude and difficult hiking had left her more exhausted than she cared to admit, and she found herself struggling to keep pace with the more experienced campers. By their second evening at the remote campsite, she was questioning her decision to accompany the group. The area they had chosen for their camp held significance in local indigenous folklore, though none of the campers were aware of the warnings that tribal elders had passed down through generations. Ute and Arapaho peoples had traditionally avoided certain high alpine areas during specific seasons, speaking of ancient guardians that protected the deepest wilderness from human intrusion. These stories had been dismissed by modern authorities as primitive superstition, but older residents of nearby towns still spoke in whispers about sounds that echoed from the mountains on clear nights. On July 18th, the group settled around their campfire after a day of exploring nearby peaks and fishing in the crystal-clear mountain stream. The temperature dropped rapidly as the sun disappeared behind the western ridgeline, and they gathered close to the flames for warmth while preparing their evening meal. Nathan entertained the group with stories from previous camping expeditions, while Riley and Sarah planned the next day's hiking route using topographic maps spread across a flat rock. Emily had been feeling unwell throughout the afternoon, experiencing headaches and nausea that she attributed to the high altitude. She retired to her tent earlier than the others, hoping that rest would help her adjust to the thin air. Liam checked on his sister periodically, concerned about her condition but reassured by her insistence that she simply needed sleep. The remainder of the group continued their evening activities, unaware that they were being observed from the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. Around midnight, Emily woke with an urgent need to relieve herself, a consequence of drinking large quantities of water to combat altitude sickness. She could hear the others still talking quietly around the campfire, their voices providing a comforting backdrop as she prepared to venture outside her tent. The night air was bitterly cold, and she wrapped herself in a down jacket before stepping away from the relative warmth of the camp. The bathroom area they had designated was located perhaps 30 meters from the main campsite, positioned downwind and behind a cluster of large boulders that provided privacy. Emily made her way carefully through the darkness, using a small headlamp to navigate the rocky terrain. As she reached the designated spot, she became aware of an unusual silence that seemed to have settled over the mountain landscape. It was during her return journey to camp that Emily first glimpsed the creature that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. A massive, fur-covered figure moved with impossible silence through the shadows between the pine trees, its enormous bulk somehow graceful despite its obvious size. The thing stood nearly 3 meters tall and appeared to be studying the campsite with obvious intelligence, remaining motionless as it observed the 4 campers gathered around their fire. Emily froze behind a large boulder, her heart racing as she watched the creature begin to move toward the camp with deliberate, predatory steps. Its eyes reflected the firelight with an amber glow that spoke of ancient intelligence, and its movement suggested a being perfectly adapted to mountain terrain. She wanted to scream a warning to the others, but found herself paralyzed by primal terror. The attack began without warning as the creature emerged from the tree line with explosive speed. Nathan was the first to die, seized by massive hands before he could react and dragged into the darkness beyond the firelight. His scream cut through the night air, followed immediately by sounds of violence that defied description. Riley attempted to reach for bear spray from his backpack but was struck down before his hand reached the canister. Sarah managed to scramble several meters from the fire before the creature caught her, her desperate cries echoing off the surrounding peaks until they were abruptly silenced. Liam called out for his sister as he tried to defend himself with a camp hatchet, but the small weapon proved useless against something of such enormous size and strength. The entire attack lasted less than 3 minutes from beginning to end. Emily's rescue came 36 hours later when she managed to activate an emergency beacon that Riley had been carrying in his pack. The Colorado search and rescue team that responded to the signal found her in a state of severe psychological trauma, barely coherent and repeating warnings about something in the forest that watched and waited. The bodies of her 4 companions were recovered from various locations around the campsite, their condition confirming that they had faced something far more dangerous than any known predator. The campsite where the attack occurred has since been quietly removed from Forest Service maps, officially due to environmental concerns, but actually because no rescue team would venture into an area associated with such violence. Local indigenous communities were not surprised by the incident, viewing it as a confirmation of warnings their elders had maintained for generations about certain places that should remain undisturbed by human presence. The Sierra Nevada mountains of California rose like a granite wall along the eastern border of the state in February 2021, their peaks shrouded in storm clouds that promised heavy snowfall. This ancient mountain range contains some of the most challenging wilderness terrain in North America, with sudden weather changes that could trap even experienced outdoor enthusiasts in life-threatening conditions. Laura Bennett, a 34-year-old cross-country skiing instructor from Sacramento, had planned a solo skiing expedition into the remote backcountry areas. An accomplished athlete with over 15 years of wilderness experience, she felt confident handling the challenging terrain and unpredictable weather conditions. Her planned route would take her through pristine forest areas rarely visited by other skiers, offering the solitude she craved after a busy winter season. The area Laura had chosen was steeped in Native American folklore, with Washoe and Miwok peoples traditionally avoiding certain high-altitude regions during winter months. They spoke of ancient spirits that roamed the deepest wilderness during storms, beings that could move through snow and ice with supernatural ease. These warnings had been dismissed by modern outdoor enthusiasts as primitive superstition. On February 12th, Laura began her expedition under partly cloudy skies, following established ski trails for the first several hours before branching off toward more remote terrain. The weather forecast had predicted light snow beginning in the late afternoon, well within her tolerance for winter conditions. She planned to ski approximately 20 kilometers into the backcountry before establishing a camp for the night. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the weather changed with frightening speed. What had been light flurries became a full blizzard within minutes, reducing visibility to less than 3 meters and creating whiteout conditions that made navigation extremely dangerous. Laura realized she needed to seek immediate shelter and began looking for natural windbreaks among the dense pine forests. As she struggled through deepening snow, Laura noticed unusual tracks pressed into the fresh powder. The impressions were enormous, measuring nearly twice the length of her own ski boots and pressed deep into the snow by tremendous weight. The tracks appeared fresh, created sometime during the storm, and followed a path roughly parallel to her own route. The temperature dropped rapidly as the storm intensified, and Laura found herself fighting hypothermia while searching for adequate shelter. The tracks in the snow seemed to be leading toward a cluster of large pine trees that might provide protection from the wind, but following them meant venturing further from her planned route. As she approached the tree cluster, Laura became aware of being watched. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, a primitive recognition of being observed by something intelligent and potentially dangerous. Through the swirling snow, she glimpsed a massive figure moving between the pine trees, with fluid grace that defied the difficult conditions. The creature stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in dark fur that seemed impervious to the bitter cold. Its eyes glowed with amber light as it observed her struggle through the deepening snow, displaying an intelligence that was far more unsettling than simple animal curiosity. Laura froze, understanding instinctively that she was being evaluated by something ancient and powerful. The being began circling her position, moving through the forest with silent efficiency, while small trees snapped like twigs in its wake. Laura attempted to continue skiing toward lower elevations, but the creature seemed to anticipate her movements, appearing ahead of her on the trail and forcing her to change direction repeatedly. For over 2 hours, the stalking continued, as Laura fought her way through the blizzard while being herded by something that clearly understood the mountain terrain far better than she did. The creature never approached closely enough for her to see it clearly, but its presence was constant, marked by the sound of breaking branches and glimpses of movement in the storm. Eventually, Laura managed to reach a Forest Service cabin that provided shelter from both the storm and whatever had been tracking her through the wilderness. She spent a terrified night listening to sounds outside that suggested something large circling the building, testing doors and windows with obvious intelligence. Rescue teams found her the following morning, suffering from mild hypothermia, but otherwise unharmed. The tracks she described were dismissed as bear sign by officials, despite their enormous size and the fact that bears should have been hibernating during winter months. Laura insisted that something intelligent had deliberately herded her toward safety, choosing to protect rather than harm her during the storm. She never returned to solo winter skiing, unable to shake the conviction that something vast and ancient still watched from the high Sierra peaks, waiting for the next storm to provide cover for its movements through the wilderness it had claimed as home. The remote Sierra Nevada backcountry of California stretched endlessly across granite peaks and pristine wilderness in August 2020, an area known for sudden weather changes and dense fog that could disorient even experienced hikers. This particular region, located roughly 60 kilometers from the nearest populated area, attracted serious outdoor enthusiasts seeking solitude away from crowded national parks and established trail systems. A group of 4 hikers had ventured into this wilderness for what they planned as a 3-day backpacking expedition. Marcus Tillman, a software engineer from San Francisco, had organized the trip with his longtime hiking partners, Bethany Cross, a nurse practitioner who specialized in wilderness medicine, Derek Ashworth, a geology professor fascinated by the Sierra Nevada's unique rock formations, and Jennifer Campos, a photographer documenting remote wilderness areas for a conservation organization. The area they had chosen held significance in local Mano and Yokuts tribal folklore, with indigenous communities traditionally avoiding certain high-altitude regions during specific weather patterns. Elders spoke of ancient guardians that became active when fog descended upon the mountains, beings that could move through mist and shadow with supernatural stealth. These warnings had been dismissed by modern hikers as primitive superstition. On August 15th, the group established their base camp in a small alpine meadow surrounded by towering granite cliffs. The weather had been clear during their hike into the backcountry, but afternoon clouds suggested the possibility of thunderstorms or heavy fog. Marcus expressed concern about the changing conditions, but the group decided to continue with their planned exploration of nearby geological formations. The fog rolled in during the early morning hours of August 16th, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien environment where visibility was reduced to mere meters. What had been a straightforward hiking area became a maze of granite boulders and pine trees that seemed to shift position in the swirling mist. The group decided to remain close to their base camp until conditions improved. Around midday, as the fog thickened rather than dissipating, the four hikers began experiencing a sense of being watched from the surrounding wilderness. Bethany mentioned hearing footsteps that seemed to parallel their movements, while Derek reported glimpsing large shapes moving through the mist just beyond visual range. Jennifer attempted to photograph the unusual atmospheric conditions, but found that her camera equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. The stalking began subtly, with equipment mysteriously displaced from where it had been left, and strange sounds echoing through the fog. Marcus discovered that his backpack had been moved several meters from his tent during a brief absence, with contents scattered as if examined by intelligent hands. The group began staying closer together, sensing that they were no longer alone in the wilderness. As afternoon faded into evening, the psychological pressure intensified. All four hikers reported feeling constantly observed, with peripheral glimpses of massive figures moving through the fog. Sleep became impossible, as sounds of breaking branches and heavy footsteps circled their camp throughout the night. Jennifer's attempts to document these sounds were frustrated by equipment failures that seemed targeted and deliberate. The physical encounter occurred during the pre-dawn hours of August 17th. The hikers were awakened by sounds of their camp being systematically dismantled by unseen hands. Tents were torn open, backpacks emptied, and clothing scattered across the meadow by something that moved with obvious intelligence through the dense fog. Attempts to defend their belongings proved futile against adversaries they could not see clearly. By morning, the four hikers found themselves bruised, scratched, and nearly naked, their clothing torn away or missing entirely. Deep scratches covered their bodies, though the wounds appeared to be carefully inflicted rather than random animal attacks. Their camping equipment was scattered across a wide area, with expensive gear apparently examined and then discarded by creatures that understood its function but had no use for human technology. The fog began clearing around noon on August 17th, allowing the disoriented hikers to attempt navigation towards civilization. They wrapped themselves in salvaged sleeping bags and emergency blankets, struggling through difficult terrain while dealing with exposure and psychological trauma. Marcus managed to activate an emergency beacon that eventually led to their rescue by search and rescue teams. The rescue team found the four hikers in a state of severe psychological distress, huddled together in a small cave roughly 5 kilometers from their original campsite. They were dehydrated, suffering from exposure, and exhibiting symptoms of acute stress disorder. Medical examination revealed numerous scratches and bruises consistent with being dragged through rough terrain, though none of the injuries appeared life-threatening. Official reports attributed the incident to disorientation caused by dense fog, suggesting that the hikers had become lost and damaged their own equipment while attempting to navigate in poor visibility. The systematic nature of the clothing removal and the precision of their injuries were explained as coincidental results of moving through dense brush and granite formations during panic-induced flight responses. The four survivors provided consistent account of being systematically stalked and tormented by intelligent beings that remained hidden in the fog. They described the sensation of being studied and evaluated by something that understood human behavior, but regarded them as temporary intruders in ancient territory. Their equipment had been examined with obvious curiosity before being deemed unworthy of retention. Bethany Cross required extensive psychological counseling to process the trauma of the encounter, consistently maintaining that the group had been deliberately terrorized by creatures displaying obvious intelligence and restraint. She argued that their survival proved the beings could have easily killed them, but chose instead to deliver a warning about venturing into prohibited territory. Local indigenous communities were not surprised when informal reports of the incident reached them through unofficial channels. Tribal elders noted that the location and circumstances matched traditional warnings about certain areas that became dangerous when fog provided cover for ancient guardians to patrol their territory. The 4 hikers never returned to wilderness backpacking, unable to shake the conviction that they had encountered something ancient and territorial that had chosen to spare their lives while delivering an unmistakable message about respecting boundaries that existed long before human maps divided the wilderness into manageable parcels for recreational use. The dense forests of western Oregon stretched along the Pacific coast in September 2018, a region where ancient Douglas fir and western hemlock created cathedral-like groves that had stood undisturbed for centuries. The Alsea River headwaters wound through these primeval forests, providing habitat for abundant salmon runs that had sustained both wildlife and indigenous communities for thousands of years. Remote stretches of these waterways remained largely inaccessible to casual anglers, requiring significant hiking through difficult terrain to reach the pristine fishing locations. Daniel Lee, a 41-year-old commercial fisherman from Portland, had taken a rare day off from his ocean-based work to pursue sea-run cutthroat trout in the remote headwaters of the Alsea River. An experienced angler with over 20 years of fishing Pacific Northwest waters, he preferred the solitude of backcountry streams to the crowded fishing spots closer to urban areas. His chosen location required a 3-hour hike through dense forest to reach a series of deep pools known for holding large fish. The area Daniel had selected held deep significance in local Confederated Tribes folklore, with indigenous communities maintaining traditional fishing rights along certain stretches of the river system. Tribal elders spoke of ancient guardians that protected the salmon runs during spawning seasons, beings that ensured the delicate balance between human harvest and natural reproduction remained intact. These stories had been dismissed by modern anglers as romantic environmentalism. On September 22nd, Daniel began his fishing expedition before dawn, hiking through fog-shrouded forest trails by headlamp to reach his preferred location along the river. The morning mist created an ethereal atmosphere as it rose from the warm water into cool air, reducing visibility but also creating perfect conditions for trout fishing. He established his base beside a large pool where the river curved around a basalt outcrop. The fishing proved exceptionally productive, with Daniel landing 6 large cutthroat trout within the first 4 hours of daylight. He carefully cleaned and packed his catch in a portable cooler, planning to share the fish with family members who rarely had access to such fresh wild salmon. The success of his morning fishing left him in excellent spirits as he prepared to pack up his equipment for the return hike. Around noon, Daniel stepped away from his fishing spot to answer a call of nature, leaving his cooler and tackle box beside the river while he moved perhaps 50 meters upstream to find privacy. The forest remained shrouded in mist that muffled sound and created an atmosphere of complete isolation from civilization. He expected to be away from his equipment for no more than a few minutes. Upon returning to his fishing location, Daniel immediately noticed that something was wrong. His portable cooler had been overturned, with the carefully cleaned fish scattered across the rocky riverbank. The heavy tackle box, which required both hands to lift comfortably, had been moved several meters from where he had left it. Muddy footprints led from the disturbed area toward the dense forest that bordered the river. Daniel knelt to examine the tracks more closely, finding impressions unlike anything in his extensive experience with Pacific Northwest wildlife. The prints measured nearly 18 inches in length and were pressed deep into the soft mud by tremendous weight. The stride length suggested a bipedal creature of enormous size, capable of covering ground with remarkable efficiency through difficult forest terrain. As he studied the evidence of intrusion, Daniel became aware of being watched from the forest shadows. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, a primitive recognition that something intelligent was observing his reactions to the theft. He slowly raised his head toward the tree line, scanning the dense understory for signs of movement. Through the swirling mist, Daniel glimpsed a massive figure partially concealed among the towering fir trees. The creature stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in dark fur that seemed perfectly adapted to the forest environment. Its enormous hands held what appeared to be several of his cleaned fish, gripped with obvious understanding of their value as food. The being's eyes reflected amber light as it studied him with unmistakable intelligence. For several long moments, the fisherman and the creature observed each other across the misty riverbank. Daniel found himself unable to move, transfixed by the realization that he was witnessing something that challenged everything he understood about Pacific Northwest wildlife. The being showed no signs of aggression, merely holding his catch while evaluating his response to the encounter. The creature retreated into the forest with fluid grace that defied its massive size, moving through dense undergrowth without breaking branches or creating the disturbance that such bulk should have produced. Within seconds, it had vanished completely, leaving only the scattered remains of Daniel's morning catch and deep footprints to prove the encounter had occurred. Daniel remained beside the river for nearly an hour after the creature disappeared, alternating between examining the physical evidence and scanning the forest for signs of continued observation. The precision with which his fish had been taken suggested intelligence rather than random animal behavior, as if the being understood exactly what it wanted and took only what it needed. The hike back to his vehicle provided ample time for Daniel to consider how he would explain the loss of his catch and the encounter with something that clearly existed outside conventional understanding of regional wildlife. He decided that filing an official report would likely damage his reputation within the fishing community while providing no useful purpose. Local indigenous community leaders were not surprised when informal word of Daniel's encounter reached them through traditional communication network. Tribal elders nodded knowingly, explaining that the river guardians occasionally revealed themselves to fishermen who showed proper respect for the resource, but took more than they truly needed for sustenance. Daniel Lee continued fishing Pacific Northwest water, but never returned to the remote Alsea River headwaters, where he had encountered something that challenged his understanding of what lived in the deepest forest. He now practices strict catch-and-release fishing, unable to shake the conviction that his harvest is being monitored by intelligences far older than human presence in the region. The incident remained undocumented in official wildlife report, dismissed by authorities as either fabrication or misidentification of known animals. However, other fishermen have reported similar experiences along remote stretches of Pacific Northwest rivers, describing encounters with beings that demonstrate obvious intelligence and territorial behavior regarding salmon runs and trout habitat.